Hello again. Thanks so much for joining me again for another episode of the Photography Made Simple podcast. Now, it's been quite a few years since I made the switch from aperture priority mode to shooting in full manual mode, and I can tell you right now it was one of the best things I ever did to improve my photography skills. It honestly felt like a whole new world had opened up to me because that's when I truly started to understand exposure and in turn how to use that knowledge to start getting the images that I wanted and that I could see in my head. Now, prior to that, when I was still shooting in aperture priority mode, I could see the photo that I wanted to take in my mind, but I could never get it to quite translate into the camera. So to be able to do that at will was a huge turning point for me. And I know that it's not just me that feels this way. We have had thousands of Auto to Awesome students, and most of them tell me that this is also when they really started to feel in control of their camera and that they could start to get the photos they wanted on demand. I'm actually going to read out something one of my students, Kathleen, put it. She said, "Changing to manual mode has been a game changer. I see now what you mean about how images just don't come out the way you envisage them on auto or any of the semi-auto modes. Today, I felt empowered." I want you to feel empowered too, whether you are a student of mine or not. So today I want to share with you some of the things I wish I had known about making the switch from the semi-automatic modes to full manual mode. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Anne, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. Now, I know that switching to manual mode can feel a little scary, and it is definitely harder at first. And this is especially so if you're not sure whether you're doing it right in the first place. So my hope is that the 10 things I'm going to share with you today will take away some of that confusion. Now, before we dive in, I do also want to let you know about a little freebie that you might find helpful, our manual settings cheat sheet. If you are finding it confusing to know which aperture number, ISO, or shutter speed settings to use, I think you're going to find that really helpful. I will link to it at the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/13, or you can go to livesnaplove.com/manual-mode and you can get it direct from there. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in to the 10 things I wish I'd known when switching to manual mode. And the first is, when photographing in manual mode, there are no go-to settings. I know that so many people wish that I could just give them some plug-and-play settings for using with manual mode, and unfortunately, it doesn't quite work like that. Firstly, the amount of light in the scene will vary from day to day, from location to location, even hour by hour, heck, even minute by minute. Since you are changing your settings in manual mode to balance exposure, in other words, how bright or how dark your image looks, your settings will change every single time you start shooting. And not only that, your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed settings control exposure for sure, but they also control how your image looks. So again, based on what's going on in the scene and what you want the final image to look like, your settings are going to be different again. This is also why two photographers could be photographing the exact same scene and might end up with completely different settings just based on how they want the image to look. So it's simply with practice that you'll get better at knowing where you need to start off with each setting and then how to balance them together to get the correct exposure that complements your vision. So remember, I can give you some guidance on where to start with your settings. You can get that at that manual settings cheat sheet. That's going to give you some suggested numbers for your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed that you can use in varying situations. But you're going to use that as that jumping off point, and remember that they're always going to need to change from there. But don't forget, you can go and download that at livesnaplove.com/manual-mode. Moving on now to number 2, and that is it's better to crank up your ISO than keep it low and underexpose your shot. So another common complaint I get is that you might find that your images have more noise, that grain or speckly stuff over your image when you use a higher ISO number. Now, because of this, I know that many people, when starting to choose their own settings, will try to use as low an ISO number as they think they can possibly get away with, even if that means the image might be underexposed. Now, if you do that, unfortunately, all that does is make sure that you get even more noise in your photos. It is much, much better to expose correctly with a higher ISO number than to use a lower ISO number and underexpose. You'll get less noise and your images will appear sharper and clearer. So when you're choosing your own settings in manual mode, don't be tempted to try and use that as a way of bringing down the ISO number to as low as you think you can get away with and then bringing up the exposure in processing. Trust me, it only makes the problem worse. It won't be doing you any favors. So make sure that you use the right ISO number to get the correct exposure. Let's move on now to number 3 of the things I wish I'd known when starting to shoot in manual mode, and that is that getting the image right in camera will give you a better photo. Now, although it can be tempting to think that we can fix everything in processing, the truth is there are some things you just can't put right after you've taken the shot. So if you overexpose to the point where you've blown your highlights or underexpose to the point of clipping your blacks, you won't be able to bring back detail into those areas because you simply can't bring back information that wasn't recorded to begin with. The other thing to remember is that significant shifts in exposure can lead to skin that doesn't look as great as it could. It can end up with a real kind of grey, pasty look to it. So for that reason, we always want to make sure that we get the exposure right in camera. Now, I'm going to share another few things with you as well. These aren't strictly limited to shooting in manual mode, but you'll want to get them right in camera too. Focus, you always want to get that right in camera since you can't fix that after the fact either. Your use of light, you can't magically make bad lighting into good lighting in post-processing. White balance, I recommend that you get that right in camera, even though you can fix that in post-production, just because if you don't yet see colour correctly, setting white balance can be tricky. And finally, composition. Although you can tweak composition in processing, you won't be able to fix or apply many composition rules after the photo has been taken. That's why in my program that I was talking about earlier, Auto to Awesome, we first teach you how to shoot in manual mode, but we also have modules on focus, white balance, light, and composition too. They are all connected and all important to get right. So although we can fix things in processing, it is much better to use editing as a way of enhancing a good in-camera image and strive to get as much right as we can in camera. Let's move on now to number 4, which is that you don't need to use manual focus when you shoot in manual mode. So just in case you thought this too, using manual mode is not the same as manual focusing. Manual focus is when you move the focus ring on your camera lens to bring an object into focus, rather than having your camera do it for you in autofocus. So in manual mode, you can definitely 100% still use autofocus where the camera will lock the focus for you and you do not have to switch to using manual focus. Now, what you should be doing is manually selecting your focus points, but the camera will still find and lock focus for you. So I just wanted to be clear about that because I actually confused the two and I know other people do it as well. So if that was something you thought, don't, you can still use autofocus when you switch to using manual mode on your camera. Okay, moving on now to number 5, and that is that the image on the back of the camera may look brighter than it does on your screen when you upload the image after shooting. So the preview screen on your camera is not the best judge of whether an image is correctly exposed. A lot of people find that when they view the image in their editing software, it can look a little darker than it did when they viewed it on the preview screen on the back of the camera after taking the picture. This is because manufacturers tend to make the back screen look brighter, so your photos look better and therefore their cameras. It's not a big deal and you can usually adjust the brightness of these screens or just compensate for it a little bit when you're shooting, but it is something to be aware of. So if you do find that you are shooting in manual mode and you're constantly underexposing a little bit, remember it could just be as simple as that screen on the back of your camera is set to too bright a level and it's just kind of throwing you off a little bit. So you can either go ahead and change that or just remember to add a little bit of exposure when you're shooting in manual mode just to compensate for it. Moving on now to number 6, and that is spot metering is your friend. So when shooting in manual mode, the best metering mode to use is spot metering, without a doubt. They are a match made in heaven, like strawberries and cream or bacon and eggs or Romeo and Juliet. And spot metering is really helpful because it helps you nail the exposure for the scene you are trying to photograph. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this does take a bit of getting used to. But once you have been using it for a while, you'll find that you can spot meter in just a few seconds and then get bang on exposure for your trouble. And remember, with manual mode, your exposure isn't changing each time. It's not constantly metering like it does in aperture or shutter priority mode. Therefore, take a few extra seconds to get your exposure right to begin with. And then you never need to worry about changing your exposure again for the rest of the shoot, assuming that the light never changes. And moving on to number 7, which is shooting in RAW is better than shooting in JPEG. Now, although I just said that you should aim to get it right in camera, and I do 100% believe that, there will undoubtedly be times when you stuff up, particularly when you first start to use manual mode. And this is when shooting in the RAW file format can be a little bit of a lifesaver. It will allow you more leeway to fixing any in-camera mistakes like under or overexposure or fixing your white balance. So although you will have to do a little bit of work processing your photos in your chosen editing software, I personally use and recommend Lightroom Classic, it is well worth it for the extra control you get over how the final image looks. So I know that there are some pro photographers who shoot in JPEG, but when you are starting out in photography and you're first making that switch to manual mode, I hate to say it, but that's the most likely time of you making mistakes. And RAW is most helpful for when you need to fix those mistakes. So I recommend RAW for a number of reasons. One, because you can get your images to look exactly the way that you want them to rather than having your camera do it for you, but also because it gives you that leeway to fix those mistakes, and the time you need that leeway is when you're first starting out in manual mode. So I do recommend making the switch to RAW when you feel comfortable enough to start editing your photos too. Moving on now to number 8. We're rattling through these. No, but number 8 is that you will need to practice. I know that using manual mode at first will feel clunky and long-winded, and you'll feel like it takes much longer than shooting in any of the aperture priority modes. So why bother? The first thing to know is that the more you use it, the easier it becomes. So being able to choose the right settings is one part of it, and the more you truly understand that, the easier it will be. But the second part is practicing until it becomes second nature. And honestly, after a while, you do it with as much instinct as you do with any real thought. So with anything in photography, it's pointless practicing without knowledge, but also knowledge without practice is pretty pointless as well. We need both working together. So again, in the Auto to Awesome program, you spend time learning about one piece of the puzzle, and then you get an exercise to go out and practice it. This is because putting the steps into action really helps make what you are learning stick. And the more you practice it, the easier and easier it will become. And kind of related to that is number 9, and that is you won't get it right every shot. So there will be times when you get the wrong exposure, or you don't get your settings quite right, or you look at an image after you've taken it and wish you had done something different with A, B, or C in your settings. It's perfectly okay. Making mistakes is part and parcel of learning photography. If you are not making mistakes, then you're not pushing yourself far enough. Be patient, aim for progression and not for perfection. You are going to take some time to make shooting in manual mode feel natural to you and to the point where you don't make mistakes. But honestly, we all make mistakes. Even if we've been shooting for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, we don't always get it 100% correct, especially if you are shooting a scene that is quite fast moving. In which case, that is exactly what editing is for. We don't want to rely on that. We want to always make sure that we have at least the ballpark correct exposure, even if it's not 100% correct. But do know you're always going to make mistakes. It's not the end of the world. We can fix a lot of them in post-processing. But just remember that the more you fail and the more mistakes you make, the better you will get. Every single mistake you make is an opportunity for you to learn something and then get it right next time. And that leads me on to my 10th and final thing I wish I'd known when making the switch to manual mode. And that is the camera does not make the photographer, but learning manual mode maybe does. So you've probably all heard this before. It's not the gear that makes a great photo, it's the person taking it. If you can learn manual mode and get an understanding of how to control your camera so you can operate in all types of lights and in all situations, you will be able to rock any type of camera, from a top-of-the-range pro camera to the basic entry-level DSLR that you're probably really keen to get away from right now. Now, I don't want to sound harsh, I really don't, but if you're not getting the images you want, it's more likely to be your fault than your camera's fault. So please spend your time and your money learning how to manually control your camera. And I promise you'll be able to take much better photos even with an entry-level camera and your kit lens. I pinky promise that. Okay, let's quickly recap those 10 things that I wish I'd known when shooting in manual mode. So number 1 is that when photographing in manual mode, there are no go-to settings. You're going to have to figure out the settings based on the light available and what you want the situation to look like. Number 2 is better to crank up your ISO than keep it low and underexpose your shot. That's just going to make the noise in your image worse, so use the settings that you need in order to get a correctly exposed photo. Which leads me on to number 3, which was getting it right in camera will give you a better photo. We don't want to make significant shifts in post-production on our exposure, on our white balance, and there's certain things that you simply cannot fix in editing. And number 4 was you don't need to use manual focus in manual mode. You want to choose your own focus point, but you don't want to use necessarily the manual focus on your lens. Number 5 is that the image on the back of your camera may look brighter than it does when you finally get that image uploaded to your editing software. You can turn down the brightness on your LCD lens or just compensate for it when shooting. Number 6 was to always spot meter, because spot metering and manual mode go hand in hand together. And that shooting in RAW is better than shooting in JPEG because it gives you that little bit more leeway in getting your exposure right in processing. Number 8 was that you need to practice. So whenever you learn something new, you need to learn it inside out, and then you need to go ahead and put that into practice. Knowledge without practice is useless, as is practice without knowledge. Number 9, you won't get it right every shot. So don't expect to switch over to manual mode and suddenly everything to be hunky-dory. There is a learning curve with this. So you are going to stuff up, but don't make that an excuse to move away from manual mode. You just need a little bit more practice. And number 10, the camera does not make the photographer, but maybe learning manual mode does. Make a point of learning your camera about light and composition, and you will be able to rock your camera regardless of what model you have. Now, don't forget, if you want a little bit more help choosing your camera settings in manual mode, go ahead and download my cheat sheet for manual settings. You'll find that at the show notes for this episode or at livesnaplove.com/manual-mode. Okay, that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed learning about the 10 things I wish I'd known starting to shoot in manual mode, and hopefully this will save you a little bit of time and frustration, and most of all, stop you from feeling like you want to give up or go back to the safety of aperture priority mode when things don't quite work out the way you want them to instantly. There is that learning curve, but I promise when you stick with it, you will feel like you are empowered when it comes to choosing your camera settings and getting the images to look exactly the way that you want them to. That's it from me. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Bye for now. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.